Well, welcome. Thank you for coming out for the Chatham County Historical Association seminar we have here today. We have a special guest. We have Mr. Baum. He's a park ranger at the Greensboro Guilford Courthouse Museum. He's been there for 9 years. He has an MA in Museum Studies from UNCG, an MFA of Documentary Films from Wake Forest. He was an intelligence officer for the U.S. Army, and his skill, he says, is explaining the research of history. So let's give a special welcome to Mr. Baum.
2 minutes. All right, we're gonna hold off for 2 minutes. But in the meantime, I do have a microphone here, but is it okay if I project? Can everybody hear me? Okay. No. Okay, I will try to use the. Oh, does it help?
That's better.
Okay, so I'll try and not move around so much so that I don't give you any feedback from the microphone. But yeah, I am going to be talking about specifically the British Army leaving the Battle of Guilford Courthouse and coming through Chatham County on their way to Wilmington. So we're talking about 3 weeks that often get overlooked. I mean, you won't really see this mentioned in most history books. Our best book about the campaign, Long, Obstinate, and Bloody by Larry Babbitt's, it's probably a paragraph or two that talks about these 3 weeks. But one of the things I love about being asked to do these talks is that it forces me to go back and look at the resources again. Because sometimes we can take for granted. You read a book or two, you read Cornwallis's account, and you feel like you know it already. But you do need to go back once in a while and see those details that maybe you weren't attuned to the first time you read it. And so that's what we're going to talk about now. And the reason I call this, the whole would sound fictitious, is that it's actually from a quote from a Hessian officer.
I had it all fixed up.
Improvise. Yep, it was working just a second ago. Yep, all right. So here is the quote. I do not think it possible to give a true description of the campaign we have had, how the men have suffered from hunger and what other hardships they have undergone. The whole would sound fictitious. Lieutenant Colonel Johann Christian Dubai, the commander of the Regiment von Bose, one of the Hessian units with the British Army, is telling his king this when he's writing back about this campaign. To give you an idea of what these guys are experiencing as they come to this part of North Carolina, Regiment von Bose, this Hessian unit, had arrived in 1776, and they spent the majority of the war up in New York City. So the majority of their experience was garrison duty. They were stuck in the forts around New York City and only occasionally did sorties out to kind of drive away the local militia. So they never really have a long campaign. And then all of a sudden in the winter of 1780-81, they get sent down here. And from the time they arrive in Charleston, South Carolina in December to the time they get to Wilmington, they are on the move. To give you an idea of how active these armies are coming through North Carolina, ideally, an army of that era should march 2 days, rest a day, march 2 days, rest a day. During this campaign, both armies are marching about 16 miles a day, 6 days a week. They are chasing each other constantly. So you can imagine these Hessians who have been in garrison duty for several years, how it would feel to go week after week, hundreds of miles, which by the way, is also how I know how far they go, because the Hessians were great at keeping records of literally how far they went every single day and where they went. So that's another interesting resource that talks about not only are they on, say, the Rocky Creek, they will tell you exactly whose farm on the Rocky Creek they stopped at. And so that's another interesting resource for us. But to kind of start the story at March 15th, the Battle of Guilford Courthouse has already happened. What these armies are having to deal with is essentially, between the two, 500 plus wounded men and over 160 plus killed. And when in this era, obviously, it's sparsely populated. So you would have to imagine, how can you even try to wrap your arms around that problem of treating that many people? And the thing is that immediately after the battle, it almost seems weird to us in the 21st century, both armies, both commanders are already writing to each other. And that's because they need to coordinate how are we going to take care of the dead and the wounded. The British hold the battlefield, so it's their responsibility, but Greene doesn't just get to sit far away and do nothing. He's going to send a couple of surgeons and surgeons' mates, and together both armies routinely do this, where they both have to try and pool their resources to do the best they can to treat the wounded. And so this is what this scene is depicting, essentially the idea of nurses and doctors on the battlefield trying to find men who can't move and addressing their wounds on the spot or seeing if they can move them to a hospital. And one thing that I've come across in this research, when you look at who is wounded and how they're wounded, one thing I've had to accept is, first of all, when you see the wounded, when you see 500 plus, you can go ahead and assume 1/3 to 1/2 of those people aren't going to make it. A lot of people are going to die. Disease is still the biggest killer. Before the 20th century, disease is always the biggest killer in any war. And so that's one thing you have to always deal with, is that a lot of these men are going to end up in the killed column. And then the other thing that you have to kind of wrap your mind around is that there's no way to predict who's going to survive their wounds. There are guys who are losing their limbs to a cannonball. There's a Hessian I know who is shot through both lungs, and both those guys live. There are other guys who get what you would think would be a superficial wound, just a light saber cut on the arm. A bullet hits their leg but didn't penetrate, just doesn't hit the bones. Those guys will die of infection. It is really impossible to predict who's going to survive a gruesome wound and who is going to be taken out eventually by infection, despite the fact that they only had a small wound. So that's what both these armies are having to deal with in the days immediately after. For about 2 or 3 days, both armies are just kind of sitting around the area, and both sides are trying to take care of the wounded. The way we describe it is that any house within a 5-mile radius of that battlefield is becoming a hospital. You need to get these men out of the element. We know it started raining right after the battle. So we know the Hoskins house, which is the historic farm at our battlefield, becomes a hospital. The courthouse was used, and the Quaker settlement there at New Garden was also used as a hospital. Another thing that these men are immediately writing each other about is prisoner exchanges. So if you're familiar with the campaign, you know the British are already struggling with their supplies and feeding their men on the way to the battle. Green's actually in pretty good shape before the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, but after the battle, they both start to struggle with supplies again. And the way that's going to affect the way they write to each other is that they are both pretty desperate for a prisoner exchange, because the way you got to think about it is that if you can barely feed your own men, you don't want to have to feed the other guy's men. So if you can exchange them, that would be great. And that way you can also get your own men back and bring your own numbers back up. As the exchange prisoners, though, Greene is realizing something that he's going to run into over and over again down to the south. And that is, who exactly are these prisoners that you're taking? What Greene is shocked to learn when he's capturing British soldiers is that by his own estimation, any given time he takes prisoners, 1/3 of these guys were in the American Army. Over and over again, both armies are finding their own soldiers serving the other side. Now, part of that could be that you do have genuinely shifting loyalties, but what both sides are doing, these soldiers are doing their own arithmetic of how to survive. So the starkest example I can give you is that if you were a Continental captured by the British, you'd been given the offer, you can either join the ranks, or we're going to send you to the prison ships in Charleston. Those places were just pits of disease. So a lot of guys thought, I would rather risk my life in a British uniform than pretty much take a death sentence going to a prison ship on the coast. And so that's something, again, Greene sees over and over again, is that they are sharing troops in a very weird way. And you also see that in the militia as well, where sometimes intimidation is used. Loyalists will force a Whig, meaning somebody who supports independence, force a Whig to serve with them, and vice versa. These guys are basically just trying to do the arithmetic of what choice do I think will keep me alive and let me survive this war. So they finally start moving this way from Guilford Courthouse after about 3 days. And Cornwallis was in the area of New Garden. This is New Garden, where the Quakers were. I got the little Park Service arrowhead where the battlefield was. Greene is 12 miles north at Troublesome Creek, his prearranged retreat point from the battle. And Cornwallis, while he's at New Garden, issues a proclamation declaring that he's won a great victory, despite the fact that he lost a quarter of his army. And he's also putting out 2 notices to the local populace. He's again asking for recruits from the local loyalists. And again, he gets the same response he's been getting over and over. People come into camp, they shake his hand, they say, thank God you're here, we're so happy to see you, and then they go home. They don't give them supplies, they don't join the ranks. And the way that this is going to be laid out for him is that there's actually a local Quaker who speaks directly to Charles Stedman. Stedman is one of Cornwallis's commissary generals. And what he tells him is that what you guys don't understand is that for the last 3 years, the war has still been going on down here. It's been a civil war between neighbors. So the reason you're not getting recruits is that nobody trusts that you're going to stick around to protect them. And that really is what's describing how people are deciding not to come up, despite the fact that they came to the South because they were told they're loyalists all over the place, and they routinely run into people who are loyalists. They don't join because they don't feel safe yet. They want the British Army to stick around. Another thing he's going to put out there is that he's going to graciously offer any American rebel who wants to come in and surrender with his weapon, he will give you a pardon. And as you can imagine, nobody really comes in and does that either. So after he's issued his proclamations, got no response from anybody from either, that's when he finally starts moving south towards Wilmington. And the whole reason he has to even do that is because he had a plan to be supplied and it had failed. Way back in January of 1781, he had sent a battalion of men under Major Gregg to Wilmington. And the idea was they would take the city and then they would start coming up the Cape Fear River. And he wanted them to come as far as, back then it was called Cross Creek, today is Fayetteville. And he wanted them to extend the supply lines up to Cape Fear so Cornwallis could stay in this region of North Carolina. But just around the time of the battle, he realized that Gregg had made it to Wilmington. Gregg took Wilmington, but he could never get out of the city. Every time Gregg tries to push his men out of the town, the local militia harass them and attack them so that he doesn't feel safe. And he doesn't feel safe even trying to take boats up the Cape Fear River. And so at that point, once Cornwallis realizes his supply lines are still on the coast, that's when he knew he had to make the several 100-mile journey just to get resupplied and get reinforcements. So that is what he's going to do. He's going to shift from the Yadkin to the Haw River so that he can get to the Cape Fear River. And as he's doing this, Greene is going to take up the pursuit because, again, Greene's army didn't take terrible damages at Guilford Courthouse, and Greene is really eager to keep attacking. What you see depicted behind me is William Washington's cavalry attacking the 17th Dragoons of the British Army. And this is the kind of fighting that's going to be happening in this area and in this county. You have the cavalry of both sides trying to screen each other, trying to figure out where the enemy is, and also keep the enemy away until you're ready to actually fight them. Now, a couple of things that are kind of also forcing Greene to be so aggressive is that he has several concerns. And these concerns are really going to dictate the pace of his army. First of all, the militia. One of the reasons he's so eager to attack is not just because Cornwallis's army is beaten up, it's because he's afraid that he's about to lose the Virginia militia. At the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, a lot of the North Carolina militia fled the battlefield. But that being said, he still had about 3,000 troops under his control. He still outnumbers the British 2-1. But he knows that the Virginia militia, their enlistments, because typically it's about 3 months is the duration of enlistment, is about to end. And so this is something he does, and you see Washington do it several times in the North, is that when you know your militia are about to go home, you ideally want to try and use them one last time before they leave. So he's pushing his men really hard so he can use the Virginia militia, but he has to keep stopping. The reason he has to keep stopping is that the situation has changed with Booth. On the way to Guilford Courthouse, he was well supplied and Cornwallis was slowly running out of supplies. Now the tables have been flipped. Cornwallis is starting to find it a little easier to find food as he goes towards the Cape Fear, and Greene has to keep stopping because his supplies can't keep up with him anymore. The other weird problem that he's running into is with ammunition, as you see on there. Typically, you don't have to worry about that. Typically, an army could, with 1 or 2 wagons, carry all the ammunition they would need for their infantry. For some reason, he's running short, and so he has to make a deliberate stop so the men have just a day to sit around and make musket cartridges. And so again, that's also slowing him down, preventing him from actually fighting Cornwallis once again. Slowly but surely, they come into the county, and it's down here at about Ramsey's Mill is where Greene is going to come closest to actually getting the fight that he wants. Again, the cavalry are out front, along with William Washington and Light Horse Harry Lee. He also has the Marquis de Malmedy, a French officer who is commanding North Carolina cavalry. And what they're trying to do, at the very least, is pin the British down. And Greene thinks if he can get them pinned, they will willingly turn and fight. And ideally, what he wants to do is he wants to trap them against the river. The first thing that's going to happen is on March 27th, there's actually going to be a brief skirmish at Ramsey's Mill. Malmedy's cavalry come running up onto the Jaegers. Jaegers are also Hessians. And what makes them different is that they are rifle-toting Hessians. They are experts at light infantry combat, and they carry a little short rifle. The cavalry surprise them, ambush them, drive them off, but within seconds, the rest of the British infantry come up to support them and drive Malmedy's cavalry away. So just like that, though, Greene has now confirmed that he has the British army up against the river. So he gives more orders for William Washington while he's pushing his main army towards the river. William Washington's supposed to find a crossing point higher up the river and try and get to the other side so he can trap Cornwallis before he can get away. But when March 28th comes, ultimately Greene's efforts fail. When they arrive, they have several kind of descriptions of what they encounter when they get there. So the first thing that we're going to see is that Greene's going to talk about the way the British left so hastily that they actually left dead men unburied. And that is something, again, you see throughout the war. That is always a huge signifier that an army was desperate and essentially running away. Neither side wanted to leave anybody's dead. The other side are their own dead unburied, but that's how desperate the British were, and they knew they were in trouble. So they crossed the river and just left the dead there. Other things that are noted is that we have one account from a Virginia Continental. The way he describes it is that they come upon the old British camp and he literally finds food still cooking on the fire. Now, whether that's a comical story or whether you actually encountered that, that again gives you an idea of how fast the British were trying to move. And as you can imagine, I've already mentioned Greene's army is having trouble getting food to his men, how grateful they would be to come into a camp and find food waiting for them. One last thing that they also mention is the fact that there is a kind of peculiar bridge that they encounter on the river. They describe the British essentially improvising a bridge to get their wagons and their artillery across. I've read online that basically, I think it's most people think now where Highway 1 crosses over the river is about where the British might have tried to construct this thing, because they describe the area as being kind of uneven, rocky shoals that pop up out of the river. And what the British were doing is any large tree, large logs, fence rails, wood from houses, they were stripping and laying down to try and create some sort of a path they could get their wagons across. They were also apparently from Ramsay's mill, reusing some of the stones from the mill to help create a bridge. And so that's why, again, one of the things they encounter of what helped the British actually get away was this improvised bridge that they find across the river. But that being said, Greene has missed his opportunity to attack a weakened British army. And so it's while he's in the area here, he's going to have to start considering what his next move should be. And so while he's in our area, Greene is considering that he shouldn't continue chasing Cornwallis to the coast, because he can already see that what was the race to the dam when Cornwallis chased him up to Virginia is now being reversed. Where once it was Greene who was getting to the other side of the river every single time, who was better supplied and had better intel, he can now see that Cornwallis is once again, every time, just a step ahead, just on the other side of a river that he can't reach him. And he knows it's only going to get worse the closer they get to Wilmington, because there's just more rivers and more creeks and more outlets that Cornwallis can set up a defensive position behind. So he says, I'm not going to play that game. I'm not going to keep chasing him. I'm not going to throw myself at some sort of strong defensive position along the coast. He's going to decide to go back into South Carolina, but before he does that, he sends Light Horse Harry Lee to continue chasing after Cornwallis. At the very least, he wants them to keep harassing him, and at least he wants Cornwallis to believe that he's still being chased to the coast. Greene, however, is going to try and switch back to the Yadkin River. Now, the reason he's doing this is that his idea essentially is, if I go into South Carolina, I will threaten the British forts down there, and Cornwallis will have to chase me. He has to come and stop me. And if he does that, that will free North Carolina and Virginia to send me more men and more supplies. But as anybody who's very familiar with this time period knows, that's not what's going to happen. Cornwallis is not going to chase after him. Now, when he's coming through here, another thing that's kind of motivating Greene to get out of here is that he's actually not having a whole lot of fun in central North Carolina. The way he's describing the region is fascinating because it's always hard to pin down people's loyalties. We've always heard that there's supposed to be a lot of loyalists in North Carolina, and Cornwallis is trying to recruit, but nobody's coming out. And the way they're describing this region as they pass through, Greene is continually complaining that anytime he sends scouts out or he sends men to go forage and get food, they are always being shot at by locals. Conversely, Banster Charlton, the cavalry commander for the British, the way he describes their movement through the region is that they never encounter any resistance. The only time they ever get attacked, he says, is when the Continental Army is around to harass them. So right there, that's giving you an idea of how people's sentiments are. But more often I try and emphasize, especially at the park, we tend to overlook the neutrals in this war. You know, we always tend to talk about, you know, rebels, patriots, loyalists, Tories, but we overlook the fact that a lot of people, and especially from this region, have more of a neutral sentiment. Ideally, perfect world, they wouldn't have wanted to fight. They just wanted to be left alone, tend to their farms, and move on with their life, and only tend to get involved, not so much when they get drawn to one side or the other, but when they get pushed by negative actions of one side or the other. And that's what we're really encountering with both of these armies here, where Green's men are getting attacked, but yet Cornwallis isn't able to get recruits. These people just want to go back to their normal lives and would prefer if these armies exited as quickly as possible. And one final thing that's really going to sour Green on this area of North Carolina is that when he gets to Little Creek in this area, it's about early April, in the middle of the night, he's going to have all 3 of his riding horses stolen in the night. So if you can imagine, he's already having a hard time feeding his men. His plans aren't going according to how he wants to. Waking up one day and finding all your horses stolen is probably not going to make you feel any better either. Now, one last thing I'll mention though, is that at this same time, while he's up here, again, if you look at his correspondence, if you look at the green papers from this time period, he's routinely writing, and they always write, you know, what date they're writing, but where they're writing from. Letter after letter after letter is from Ramsey's Mill. It's where he's writing all these letters. And at this time, he's writing to his wife, Katie Green, still up in New England. Now, back when he was a commander in the North, the pace of operations was a little bit slower, so it was generally possible to sometimes take a break and go see his wife. Down here, as we already established, they're on the march every single day. So he's having to essentially argue with Katie that, no, you cannot come down to the South. Part of the reason he doesn't want her down here is because they're having to move every single day. But the other thing he keeps mentioning to her, and will be a theme of his letters throughout the Southern campaign, is that he doesn't want her to see the way the war is going down in the South. Something that continually shocks him, and he talks about in a lot of his letters, is the sheer amount of violence between his army and the British, as well as the violence he's seeing perpetuated one neighbor against another. He's so shocked, despite the fact that they had this kind of fighting up in New Jersey in the North, the level that it's happening is genuinely shocking to him, and he tells his wife that he doesn't want her to be exposed to that, and that's another reason why he's trying to tell her it's not really safe for you to come down here at this time. As for Cornwallis, he is eventually going to clear Cross Creek. There was a militia contingent that came out to try and stop them. We think it was about 400 to 500 men. They go to Cross Creek and they're trying to destroy some supplies and take supplies away so that the British can't get it. But ultimately, Cornwallis arrives too soon. They see that he still has their contingent outnumbered and they are going to retreat. The British do capture some supplies, burn some supplies that they can't use, and continue on from there. Shortly after they leave, that's when Cornwallis is going to suffer a really harsh personal loss. James Webster was the commander of the 33rd Regiment of Foot, and at Guilford Courthouse, his regiment is one of the first to try and crack Green's continental line near the courthouse. And as they attack, Webster himself gets shot in the knee and wounded. Webster's going to be able to keep up with the army. He leaves with them, but it's by the time of the first week of April, he's finally going to die of an infection. And this is such a deep loss to Cornwallis, partly because the 33rd Regiment of Foot was Cornwallis's regiment. And so it's kind of odd, bears explaining, back in this era, regiments could have essentially a proprietor. So Cornwallis was technically the commander of the 33rd Regiment, but obviously as a general commanding whole armies, he's not doing that personally. James Webster was the man who commanded his regiment for him. And they had a close relationship. We know this because back in 1774, before the war even started, Cornwallis personally wrote to the Secretary of War arguing that James Webster should be hopped. He had 2 people above him who should have been promoted. He argues for Webster to be put ahead of them in line so that he can get his regiment's command. That's how confident he is in Webster, and that's how close the relationship is. We also see the closeness of this relationship when he writes about his death at this time. There's a story that comes from one British officer who says that when Cornwallis learns of Webster's death, he looks down and he says that I have lost my scabbard. So obviously insinuating that a sword and a scabbard are a team, are a central tool of war. What we know he actually says is in his letters, he doesn't say I have lost Colonel Webster, I have lost Colonel James Webster. He says I have lost poor Webster. So very much a kind of more personal touch. So he's lost so many officers in this battle, but this one sticks out particularly for him. And so he will eventually get to Wilmington, as we know, he will refit, resupply, and then it's there that he essentially has the same idea Greene had. So Greene went to South Carolina because he wanted Cornwallis to chase after him. Cornwallis in Wilmington has the same idea. I'm going to go into Virginia because that will force Greene to chase after me. And when he comes up after me, that will free North Carolina and South Carolina to be pacified by my troops. And that will give me an opportunity to bring the harsh hand of war to Virginia. As we all know, neither man chase the other. They go in separate directions. And I will leave their part of the story there. I'm sure you're all very familiar with Greene's campaigns in South Carolina and Cornwallis's campaigns in North Carolina. I would like to finish though by talking more about what life was like in this area, the civilian experience. Because again, when we talk about battles, we tend to get very excited about military movements, artillery and cavalry. It's important to remember that the way these armies survive is through foraging. Neither of these armies have the ability to ship all the food they need from Charleston or from up in Virginia at Petersburg. They have to forage off the land, which means ideal scenario, you send an officer out with some men, they go to a local farm, they come to your farm, they say, I see you're growing such and such bushels of wheat. We're going to take these, the fair market value for these bushels of wheat is this. Here's your money, thank you, goodbye. Ideally. One problem you're going to run into that with that is that the British have hard currency. They have coins, gold and silver. So that has value, the value is going to stay. The Americans have to pay you either with continental dollars, which have collapsed in value by this point, or more often what they're doing at this point is essentially giving you an IOU. Basically saying that when the war is over, you can take this to your local state government and they will repay you. So you can imagine how happy you would be as a farmer who has to make ends meet, being given an IOU that you don't know if it's going to have value in a few months. And so that's why it's always important to remember how these civilians are experiencing this and why both sides would just want both armies to leave this region is because at the end of the day, you don't know if you're going to be paid for your supplies, and you also don't know how you're going to be treated by other armies. One thing we see both commanders writing to their men about or issuing orders about is that they routinely have to have inspection of baggage because they get reports that men are abusing the local populace and stealing things. It gets so bad in Cornwallis's army that not only does he have his men come out for inspection, camp followers, the women who worked with the army and did essential duties like serving as nurses, they were also forced to come out for inspection because he was suspecting they were stealing things as well. And so if you're the local farmer, that's what you're always thinking. Regardless of what your loyalty is in this war, when you see an army coming to your farm, you might view them as they're the people who are going to protect you. They're the people who can save you. You identify with them. Just as equally, you could view them as a bunch of locusts coming to your farm because you don't know what they're going to take. You don't know if they're going to pay you. And even worse, once the disciplined soldiers leave, there's always the chance that some of the ne'er-do-wells of the army are going to stick around. Because while armies try and impose discipline, they recruit everybody and anybody and everybody. And so that's something that can also happen as well, is that once the army is coming by, you've said hello, you've given them stuff and they've gone away, the stragglers, the people who are deliberately hanging back are going to show up later and take something, and at best, just steal from you, at worst, abuse you and your family while they take things. And so that's why you can imagine people of this area would want to be neutral. After so many campaigns of Whig militia attacking Tories, Tories attacking Whig militia, major armies coming through, you can understand after 6 years how you might just want both armies to leave so that you can finally get back to your normal life. And so, with that concludes the extent of my remarks. Does anybody have?
One question.
Yes.
I've read that Cornwallis had a load of gold to bribe the locals,
Mm-hmm.
and it was getting heavy to haul through the woods.
Mm-hmm.
So they buried it in the walls of the deep river. Yeah, so somewhere, but anyway, you didn't mention the gold.
The one thing we see Cornwallis where he talks about gold is that he's actually complaining that he doesn't have any. He's writing, so at this point, there's a British force up in the Chesapeake Bay area. William Phillips is in their commander at this point. He's writing to Phillips, and he's also writing to Clinton back in New York that he has run out of gold by this point. He did have some, and he did, because again, if you're gonna get supplies.
Dug a hole.
you put it into- Exactly. But yeah, Cornwallis, as far as we can tell, at this point, is complaining that he doesn't have gold, and that is, he's worried about how that will affect his ability to, as you said, influence people's political leanings, but also affect your ability to easily buy supplies.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
Am I correct that Cornwallis, because of the battle of Guilford, he had less than 1,000 men with him at that time? And when he gets up to Yorktown, how many men did he?
It's a great question. So at Guilford, he had about 2,100 men. He loses about 500, so he has 1,500 probably with him when he's coming through here. And that is also going to be an influence of why he goes to Virginia, actually. So he has thousands of men manning all the forts of South Carolina. But part of the reason he wants to go up to the Chesapeake is because there are, I think it's about 4,000 British troops up in the Chesapeake. And if he goes up there, not only he can use them because he will be the ranking officer up there. So he's partly thinking, I'm going to go up to the Chesapeake, not only to bring war to Virginia, because he wants to fold those men into his army and rebuild his army that way by just absorbing a force that was already there. Yes.
Was it kind of based on the matter of honor for in this area? After the Battle of Culloden, when the British started the clearance of Scotland, they required a loyalty over the Scottish, and he didn't want Culloden, but offered free ride in America, many of them to Wilmington, we cleared the valley. So my impression is that a lot of people who remained loyalists, and actually fought patriots, did so because of sense of honor, they signed a vote.
Yes, yes, and especially when you look back at Battle of Morse Creek, at the beginning of the war, that is a huge influence for those troops that are going to join and try and meet Clinton's men in Wilmington. But yeah, there is a pre-existing idea that the reason you are here, the reason you got your land was because of the British government. And so loyalty definitely is playing into specifically, especially with the Scottish diaspora that are living in this area. That is absolutely a major motivator for them to have that loyalty. Yeah.
What was their line of march compared to where we're sitting right at this moment? How close to?
Unfortunately, I don't know the exact line of march, and that's because when I was looking through the correspondence, as they get more active, gets more patchy because they have less time to write. So I can only tell where they are stopping. And so, and looking at the maps of the era, especially with this one, you can see they depict one major road running through what is today the county. But even then, I'm not entirely sure where it is. So unfortunately, I do not have a genuinely good answer for you about exactly where they are marching through. That being said, I think with the size of the county and the size of these armies, you can almost assume that some contingent of troops pass through all the areas of this county, because when these armies move through, to kind of draw a picture for you, the main body, the majority of the troops are going to be along the main route, but you're sending infantrymen out to scout and to keep track of where things are. And you're sending the cavalry even farther to scout and find supplies. So as you send these men to go out and do these things, while you have, maybe 1,000 guys using the main road here, you have these long tendrils of both armies that are sweeping out and sweeping the countryside, looking for the enemy and looking for food.
They have a repeat of the Civil War.
Yeah. Some people. Comment of this is kind of a civil war. Yeah, that's an interpretation that's being used more and more today. More and more historians are generally using that in books that, especially like I said, the way these neighbors are attacking each other over their political stances is absolutely very much like a civil war. Yes, over here.
Excuse me. Ray, could you come over? Folks are gonna watch this and can hear your question.
My understanding that Cornwallis was in snow camp in a mill.
Yes.
From the mill, we came to Pittsburgh, we stayed at the Chatham Courthouse. You know how that happened?
That
You know the
no,
route?
I don't know the route. No, unfortunately not.
Because with all the growth we now have coming in the county, we know that you travel from Chatham Courthouse down Cross Creek Road And that's what it was called, not Pittsburgh Montague Road. And then from there, he went down to Cross Creek, which is now Fayetteville. So them are key points that I would like to know, and if you can come across any information in reference to them travels. I'd like to say, it stayed at Miles Gerlach's home.
Mhm.
And if you look at the dates, they said Miles Gerlach had passed, but he didn't, or another, the dates don't correspond, so it'd be nice to get some more information on that.
Okay. Yeah, and that is consistently a problem, is being able to tell exact routes of how they move around, point to point, yeah. Yeah,
Early on, you mentioned partisan war in New Jersey, of which there was a lot, church burnings and, murders and whatnot.
Mhm.
And it used to shock the northern action, but in the South, all that had been going on. And the question really is, this garrison regiment, when they finally go down to the Hessians, on Barbosa, and they get there, now they're exposed to heat, illness and whatnot. How much did that degrade the army? And then there was I don't know if they had run the race to the Dan or not, but how did they fare?
yeah, so how does the environment itself kind of wear down the British Army? And we know, we just came across, one of our historians at the park came across, there's a British doctor. We'd always heard this old tale that one of the local notables of Guilford County got a walking stick from a British officer. But that was all we ever heard. So we're always sounded like kind of maybe it might be a tall tale. But then one of our historians came across, through piecing together several different post-war accounts, that this guy actually existed and that he actually did give his walking stick away to the local doctor in Guilford County. But the reason I bring him up is that he is the way we know that malaria is absolutely wreaking havoc on the British Army. Cornwallis, again, many of the motivations for him to keep moving is that he doesn't want to be on the coast in the deep south for another malaria season. So that's another reason that he wants to keep moving. In terms of Hessians, especially the Hessians are great for kind of slice of life stuff, because again,
Their diaries are amazing.
Yeah, their diaries are amazing.
Detail-oriented.
and as you pointed out, the Carolinas are completely different environment from Central Europe. And these guys are talking about, if you look at some of their diaries, there's guys who talk about, they would say that, the lightning is brighter in America. They would say the thunder is louder in America. There's guys who, by the time they get into Virginia, they have a conversation. They see an alligator for the first time, and they wonder if the armored plates are thick enough to stop a musket ball. So these guys generally are, they are, when you look at Hessian stuff, especially for them, every bit of weather we have down in the South is more extreme than anything they've ever experienced in Europe. And that absolutely is taking a toll on them. Yeah.
How long a period did the Cornwallis stay in Hillsborough?
In Hillsborough, so he's back there in February. He's staying for about 2 or 3 days at that point. And he's doing it partly to try and recruit, but also part of the problem why he can't stay so long is that Greene doesn't stay a long time in Virginia. Greene comes back in, and Greene is sending his own cavalry to continually harass Cornwallis so that he can't feel safe. And so part of the reason he's going to stay a couple of days is that he just literally can't. Supplies, again, are also why he can't stay very long. It's only a couple of days because if you keep 1,000 guys in any one place in the dead of winter, you are going to exhaust the countryside very quickly. Yes. Ramsey's Mill, I don't think there's anything still on the site. And every other time you see it in the historical records for the guys when they're campaigning through here, they refer to it as Ramsey's Mill. Yes, yeah.
That's the area it's called
Lockville?
Yeah, it's a little bit. In the big circle.
It says Lockville. It says Lockville today. In the correspondence back then, there would have been the mill, and I believe there was a tavern by Colonel Ramsey as well. And so those are the 2 points of reference in the 18th century that they will reference is Ramsey's Tavern and Ramsey's Mill.
Tavern. Sure. Yeah, tavern.
Really?
My colony, standing in the building, living in an old tavern.
Oh, okay.
I think there's a monument in Granville today.
Is there?
They claim Cornwallis.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay.
I live in northwestern Chatham County, and it's pointed out to me where they all Sloan Road was pretty deep indentation. It's right at the entrance of Chatham County Northwest Park, which is Fort Road. I know two people, one still alive, farmers, who found British cannonball in their field. One is right above the Northwest Park. The other is down Gum Springs, Soquel Road, which is east-west road. Do you think that there was any kind of skirmish there, or were soldiers having carried cannonballs and just discarding them? The reason they think there was British cannonballs across the diameter. One is downstairs in the museum. That's the one that Dan Graham found. Do you have any comments on that?
So in terms, there's no major skirmishes that I came across. That being said, it is always possible that minor ones can happen. So usually when they're writing about them, it's when if enough men are being engaged that the army has to essentially pause enough to even pay attention to the fighting. That's usually when they're going to write about it. But there's no major skirmishes that I remember coming across or anything that would have employed artillery in that area. Now, one thing that could have happened is that at this point, the British really have tons of artillery because they captured the American artillery at Guilford Courthouse. So not only do they have the American cannons, they also have all their ammunition wagons. That's it's a great thing if you look in Cornwallis's papers. He has details not only of soldier losses, but everything captured as well. So we know that they have an abundance of that, but I don't think there's no reason to think that they might discard them for any reason, unless for some reason maybe the manufacturing of American cannonballs, they weren't the pipe diameter for, because they're both using 6-pounders, so they still have the same artillery. So then it would be just a question of, I don't know, maybe if they just found something that was not up to their standards, would they get rid of it? But otherwise, no, I unfortunately don't have a good answer as to how they could have ended up there, other than, it is completely plausible that wagons break down, you have to move stuff from one wagon to the next. Maybe something comes out at that point. Right here.
Answer questions of questions of a hypothesis I had about the relatives I've been tracking. When members of my family joined the DAR, but are no longer eligible because of possible treason. They were Rutherford County, Tryon County, farmer, militia, and apparently of 24 sons. They kept alternating loyalty. So apparently the last loyalty to some of them was not quite so positive, though I'm trying to track them down for one more record. But what you just said means an awful lot as to it might not have been they were loyal as much as they were just trying to survive. So that sort of helps.
I'm glad that helps because that is a prospect militiamen were subjected to all the time. I mean, if a bunch of guys show up to your house in the middle of the night and say, well, we're going on campaign at the end of the week, I hope you're with us, would be sure would be a bad thing to happen to your barn if you didn't come with us. What do you think do you think they're gonna risk getting their, and that's, absolutely. That's something you see all the time in all kinds of resources, is people being coerced into serving one side or the other several times.
What is the name of the river? Main river on that slide?
So the one going straight down the middle, the big one, that is the Haw. Yep. Yes.
We are a Quaker family and we attend Spring Friends meeting in Snow Creek. The old history supposedly includes Cornwallis butchering, his troops butchering meat from farms on church pews. They haven't heard that one before.
They do come across a lot of beef. I've never heard of them butchering them on the pews, but in that area, they do talk about coming across a large herd of beef cattle, and which is notable for them since they're running out of food. That would be wonderful to find, but they don't mention anything beyond that. Yeah, they just mentioned that they came across the beef.
May not be unusual for the British to do that. I mean, they buried Continental upside down in Philadelphia, they fell and other stuff. And war was hell in the South because of the partisan nature, you know, the strange terrain, everything else, you know. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, it wouldn't be surprising.
All right.
Yeah, let's have a hand, Mr. Baum. This was awesome for me. I'm the chair of the Historic Association, and we are endeavoring on a map so we can show where things happened on this campaign with Cornwallis and Greene and Chatham County. So we can mark locations to make the county more interesting, maybe give developers a name for the development instead of oak pines or whatever. So we actually have real history names for some of the things happening around here. And see this room so filled up with the people in this heat. It's just amazing to me. So thank you very, very much for coming out today. I really appreciate that. If you have not joined the Historic Association, please support what we do by joining. That would be the thing that would help us the most. I'm going to ask Mr. Baum if he would go downstairs where it's cooler, and if he can answer questions down there. We might have some individual questions. Thank you very much for coming today.
I'm on the same committee that Dan just mentioned.